The clock on the emergency room wall ticked past midnight as another wave of pain shot through her stomach. Special Agent Thompson shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair, trying to find a position that would ease the growing discomfort. As one of the FBI's top investigators in the Civil Rights Division, she was used to maintaining her composure in challenging situations, but this pain was becoming harder to ignore. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she observed the busy emergency room. A young mother comforted her crying child with a scraped knee, an elderly man dozed in his wheelchair, and a couple filled out paperwork at the front desk. Despite arriving over an hour ago and describing symptoms that pointed to appendicitis, she was still waiting while others were called ahead. Thompson wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, her dark skin glistening under the harsh hospital lighting. She had been tracking her symptoms all day. The pain that started near her belly button and moved to her lower right side, the fever that had begun to climb, and the increasing nausea that made even sitting upright a challenge. With 15 years of FBI experience, she knew how to analyze situations objectively, and everything pointed to appendicitis, just like what her aunt had experienced last year. A group of medical students rushed past, their white coats fluttering as they followed a resident physician on rounds. Thompson noticed how some patients seemed to get immediate attention while others, particularly those of color, waited for hours. As an FBI agent specializing in healthcare discrimination cases, these patterns weren't new to her, but experiencing it firsthand was different. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through work emails to distract herself from the pain. Her team was investigating several cases of healthcare discrimination across the state, but she never expected to potentially become another statistic herself. The irony wasn't lost on her as she clicked through reports of similar waiting room experiences from other minority patients. The pain intensified again, causing her to inhale sharply. The nurse at the desk glanced up briefly before returning to her computer screen. Thompson straightened her blazer, a habit from years of maintaining professionalism under pressure. Her badge and credentials remained tucked away. She believed in fair treatment for everyone, not just those with authority. Another patient who had arrived after her was called in, this time a businessman with what sounded like a mild headache. Thompson checked her watch again, calculating how long she'd been waiting. The symptoms were getting worse, and her law enforcement training told her that waiting too long with appendicitis could be dangerous. A young nurse walked past, and Thompson politely raised her hand to get her attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "I've been waiting for quite a while, and my symptoms are getting worse." The nurse promised to check on her status but didn't return. The emergency room continued its busy rhythm, a stream of patients flowing in and out while she remained in her uncomfortable chair. She thought about her grandmother's words from years ago, "Stay strong, but never stay silent." Those words had guided her career choice and her dedication to fighting discrimination. Now they echoed in her mind as she prepared to advocate for herself, not just as an FBI agent, but as a patient deserving of equal care. Little did the hospital staff know that their actions tonight would set in motion a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted problems within their institution. For now, though, Thompson focused on controlling her breathing through another wave of pain, watching the emergency room doors and waiting for her name to be called, knowing that what happened next would test both her patients and her principles. The night was far from over, and this was just the beginning of a story that would change not just her life, but the lives of countless others who had faced similar discrimination in their darkest hours of need. Sometimes the biggest cases don't start with a formal investigation, but with a personal experience that opens one's eyes to a truth that can no longer be ignored. After 3 hours of waiting, Thompson finally heard her name called. By now, the pain had become so intense that even walking was a challenge. She carefully made her way to the examination room, one hand steadying herself against the wall. The room was cold and sterile, with bright fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and unwelcoming. The doctor entered the room without looking up from his tablet, his white coat wrinkled from what appeared to be a long shift. He didn't introduce himself or make eye contact, instead sighing heavily as he scrolled through her digital chart. "So, what brings you here tonight?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was more of an inconvenience than a medical consultation. "I've been experiencing severe abdominal pain," Thompson began, her voice professional despite her discomfort. It started near my belly button and moved to my lower right side. I also have a fever and the pain is getting worse. She tried to continue explaining her symptoms, but the doctor cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Sounds like gas pains to me, he interrupted, still not making eye contact. Have you tried taking some over-the-counter medication? His fingers tapped impatiently on the tablet screen, already seeming to have made up his mind without performing any examination. Thompson took a deep breath, fighting both the pain and growing frustration. Actually, doctor, I'm familiar with these symptoms because several family members have had appendicitis. I really think this might be. Listen, he cut her off again, finally looking up with an expression of barely concealed contempt. I've been doing this for 20 years. I think I can tell the difference between a real emergency and someone overreacting to a minor digestive issue. His emphasis on certain words carried unmistakable undertones of prejudice. The young nurse in the room shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Thompson and the doctor. She seemed to want to say something but remained silent, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. The tension in the room was palpable. I understand your experience, doctor, Thompson replied calmly, though her pain was intensifying. But I've been waiting for hours and my symptoms match those of appendicitis. I'd appreciate if you could run some basic tests to rule it out. She maintained her composure, years of FBI training helping her stay professional in the face of obvious discrimination. The doctor's expression hardened. You know, we get a lot of people in here looking for pain medication, he said, his implication clear in his tone. Maybe you'd be better off visiting a community clinic instead. That might be more suitable for your needs. He began writing on his tablet, clearly preparing to discharge her. Thompson watched as he typed, noting how he hadn't performed a single physical examination or ordered any tests. The pain in her side was now excruciating, but something else was building inside her, a familiar determination she usually felt when confronting injustice in her professional life. The nurse looked increasingly distressed, probably having witnessed similar situations before, but feeling powerless to intervene. The doctor's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was potentially dangerous, and Thompson knew she needed to take action, not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced similar treatment without the power to fight back. As the doctor turned to leave, clearly considering the matter settled, Thompson realized this moment would define not just her night, but potentially the future of patient care in this hospital. Sometimes the most important battles for justice don't happen in courtrooms or during raids. They happen in quiet moments like these, when someone decides they've had enough. The air in the room felt electric with tension as Thompson prepared to reveal her true identity. The next few moments would change everything, but first, she had one more chance to see if the doctor would do the right thing on his own. Doctor, she said firmly, I need you to understand the seriousness of my symptoms and provide appropriate medical care. Her voice carried the weight of authority she usually reserved for official FBI business. What happened next would shock everyone in the room, but it would also set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of discriminatory practices and lead to real change in the healthcare system. Sometimes the most powerful moments of truth come when we least expect them, even in a simple emergency room examination. The doctor's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. His suggestion about drug-seeking behavior wasn't just an insult, it was a clear example of the prejudice Thompson had spent her career fighting against. The small examination room suddenly felt even smaller as the tension grew. I need to see your insurance card again, the doctor demanded, his tone dripping with suspicion. He stood by the door, arms crossed, as if expecting her to cause trouble. The young nurse in the corner looked down at her shoes, her discomfort with the situation evident in her rigid posture. Thompson reached for her purse, moving slowly due to the pain. Before I show you anything else, she said carefully, I'd like you to explain why you haven't performed any physical examination or ordered any tests. Her voice remained steady, though the pain in her side was now shooting down her leg. The doctor's response came with a condescending smile. Look, I've seen hundreds of patients like you. You come in here claiming severe pain, hoping to get something prescribed. I'm not falling for it. He glanced at his watch impatiently. There are actual sick people waiting. The nurse finally spoke up, her voice quiet but determined. Doctor, maybe we should at least check her vital signs. But he cut her off with a sharp look that made her step back, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "I don't need a lecture from you about patient care," he snapped at the nurse. Turning back to Thompson, he continued, "As I said, you can try the community clinic down the street. They're more accustomed to dealing with your type of situation." Thompson felt her temperature rising, and not just from the fever. In 15 years of FBI work, she documented countless cases of discrimination, but experiencing it firsthand in a medical emergency was something else entirely. She thought about all the other patients who'd faced similar treatment without having the power to fight back. The pain surged again, causing her to wince. The doctor interpreted this as acting and scoffed. "If you were really in that much pain, you wouldn't be able to sit there arguing with me." His dismissive attitude reflected years of unchecked bias, the kind that could cost lives. The nurse shifted her weight from one foot to another, clearly torn between her professional duty and fear of challenging authority. Thompson caught her eye, seeing in her expression the same conflict she'd witnessed in many witnesses to discrimination, the desire to help fighting against the fear of consequences. "Let me be very clear," Thompson said, her breathing now labored but her voice firm. "You haven't taken my temperature, checked my blood pressure, or even palpated my abdomen. You made assumptions based solely on my appearance. Do you treat all your patients this way, or just the ones who look like me?" The doctor's face reddened. "I'm not going to stand here and be accused of," he began, but Thompson cut him off, something she rarely did except in the most serious situations. "Those aren't accusations," she said, each word measured and clear. "They're observations, facts. And I document facts very carefully in my line of work." She reached again for her purse, but this time with a different purpose. The doctor's expression shifted from anger to something closer to fear as he realized this patient might not be as powerless as he'd assumed. The nurse had stopped pretending to write on her clipboard and was watching intently, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Thompson could have revealed her FBI credentials immediately upon entering the hospital. She could have demanded special treatment or thrown her weight around. But that wasn't her way. She believed in giving people the chance to do the right thing on their own, to show their true character. Now she had seen enough. The small exam room had become more than just a place of medical care. It was about to become the scene of a long overdue reckoning. Sometimes the most powerful moments of justice come when those who abuse their authority finally realize they've picked the wrong person to discriminate against. As Thompson prepared to reveal her true identity, she thought about all the patients who had sat in this same room, facing the same discrimination without the power to fight back. What happened next wouldn't just be about her getting proper medical care. It would be about ensuring that nobody else would have to experience what she had endured tonight. Time seemed to slow down in the small examination room. The doctor stood by the door, his hand already on the handle, ready to dismiss another patient without proper care. The young nurse watched with bated breath, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. "You want to see my ID?" Thompson asked, her voice steady despite the stabbing pain in her side. "I'll show you exactly who I am." She reached into her blazer pocket, moving deliberately despite her discomfort. The doctor's impatient expression froze as she pulled out not an insurance card, but a leather wallet with a gleaming metal badge. "I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she announced, holding up her credentials. "Head of the Civil Rights Division's Healthcare Discrimination Task Force." The badge caught the fluorescent light, its golden surface reflecting onto the doctor's suddenly pale face. The change in the room was instant and electric. The doctor's hand dropped from the door handle as if it had burned him. The nurse's clipboard slipped slightly in her grasp, making a soft clicking sound in the now silent room. Even the constant hum of the hospital equipment seemed to fade into the background. "I spent the last 15 years investigating cases exactly like this one," Thompson continued, her professional tone carrying years of authority. "Instances where medical professionals let their prejudices override their oath to provide care. Cases where assumptions and bias led to delayed treatment, misdiagnosis, or worse." The doctor's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, fear, and something that looked like recognition. Perhaps he was remembering other patients he had dismissed, other lives he might have put at risk with his assumptions. "I didn't come here tonight as an FBI agent," Thompson said, fighting another wave of pain. I came as a patient needing medical care. I wanted to see if the reports we've received about this hospital were true. Unfortunately, you've confirmed every single one of them." The nurse stepped forward now, finding courage in the shifting power dynamic. "I can get the head of emergency medicine right away," she offered, her voice stronger than before. The doctor didn't even try to stop her as she hurried from the room. Thompson kept her badge visible on her lap as she continued, "You know what the saddest part is? I actually hoped I was wrong. I hoped that all those complaints we'd received were isolated incidents. But in just 3 hours, you've demonstrated textbook discrimination, making assumptions about drug-seeking behavior, dismissing serious symptoms without examination, suggesting I go to a community clinic instead." The doctor, who had been so dismissive moments ago, now seemed to be struggling to find words. I didn't," he stammered, but Thompson held up her hand. "Every year, countless patients suffer because of biases like yours," she said. "People die because doctors dismiss their pain, ignore their symptoms, or assume they're exaggerating. The only difference tonight is that you chose the wrong patient to discriminate against." A commotion in the hallway signaled the arrival of hospital administrators. The nurse had returned with not only the head of emergency medicine, but also the hospital administrator. They rushed into the already crowded room, their faces showing they understood the severity of the situation. "We need a complete blood count, urinalysis, and CT scan immediately," Thompson said, her voice now showing signs of strain from the pain. "And I suggest you find another doctor to perform them." She didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. Her badge and position carried all the authority needed. The next few minutes were a blur of activity as new medical staff rushed in. The original doctor backed out of the room, knowing his career might have just taken a devastating turn. But this wasn't about one doctor's career, it was about changing a system that too often failed the people it was meant to protect. As Thompson was finally wheeled away for proper medical tests, she caught the eye of an elderly woman in the waiting room, someone who had been there even longer than she had. With a subtle nod, Thompson made a mental note. Once she recovered, there would be work to do. Real change was coming to this hospital, and it started tonight. The revelation of her identity wasn't just a moment of personal triumph, it was the beginning of a larger investigation that would bring to light years of systematic discrimination. Sometimes the most effective investigations don't start with a formal complaint or a planned operation, but with a simple visit to the emergency room that turns into something much more significant. The hospital corridors buzzed with urgent activity as word spread about the FBI agent in the emergency room. The head of emergency medicine, a tall woman with graying hair and kind eyes, personally supervised Thompson's care. The change in treatment was dramatic, but it only highlighted how things should have been from the start. "Your temperature is 102.3, and your white blood cell count is extremely elevated," the new doctor explained, pointing to the test results. "The CT scan confirms acute appendicitis. We need to prep you for emergency surgery immediately." Her voice carried genuine concern, the kind that should be standard for every patient. The hospital administrator, still adjusting his tie from rushing in, stood nervously at the foot of Thompson's bed. "Agent Thompson, I want to personally assure you that what happened earlier does not reflect our hospital's values." He looked genuinely distressed, though Thompson wondered if he was more concerned about the hospital's reputation or the patient's well-being. "We'll discuss values later," Thompson replied, wincing as a nurse inserted an IV. "Right now, I'm more interested in knowing how many other patients are sitting in that waiting room, being ignored like I was." Even in pain, she remained focused on the bigger picture. The young nurse who had witnessed the earlier discrimination hadn't left Thompson's side. "There are at least 3 patients who've been waiting longer than 6 hours," she said quietly. "One of them has been complaining of chest pain." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood firm, finally able to speak up. The hospital administrator's face paled. "I'll have someone check on them immediately," he said, rushing out of the room. Through the window, Thompson could see the waiting room suddenly spring to life with medical staff attending to long-ignored patients. As the surgical team prepared for the operation, Thompson reached for her phone. "I need to make 2 calls," she said firmly. "First to my team at the FBI, and then to the Department of Health." The administrator, who had just returned, froze in his tracks. "Is that really necessary?" he asked, his voice strained. "We're already taking steps to address the situation." Thompson looked him straight in the eye. "This isn't just about tonight," she said, her voice clear despite the pain medication beginning to take effect. "This is about every patient who came before me and every patient who will come after. Change doesn't happen by keeping things quiet." The pre-op room became a temporary command center. Thompson briefly spoke with her FBI team, setting in motion an investigation that would examine years of patient records. The young nurse, finding her courage, offered to help identify other instances of discrimination she had witnessed. "You understand this could affect your job?" Thompson asked her quietly. The nurse straightened her shoulders. "Some things are more important than keeping quiet," she replied, thinking of all the patients she had watched suffer in silence. As Thompson was wheeled towards surgery, she caught glimpses of the changes already taking place. The dismissive doctor was nowhere to be seen, probably in an emergency meeting with hospital leadership. Other doctors and nurses moved with new purpose, suddenly very attentive to every patient in the waiting room. The anesthesiologist began explaining the procedure, but Thompson's mind was already working on what would come next. She knew that tomorrow's headlines wouldn't just be about an FBI agent facing discrimination. They would be about systemic changes needed in healthcare. "We're ready to begin," the surgeon announced as the operating room staff efficiently moved around her. Thompson felt the anesthesia beginning to take effect, but she fought to stay awake for one more moment. "When I wake up," she said to the hospital administrator who had followed them to the doors, "I expect to hear that every patient in that waiting room has received proper care. This isn't just about making things right for me." The last thing she saw before drifting off was the administrator nodding vigorously, already pulling out his phone to make calls. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create change, and this crisis was about to transform not just one hospital, but potentially the entire healthcare system. As consciousness faded, Thompson thought about all the patients who had sat in that waiting room before her, their pain and concerns dismissed. Tonight's events would ensure their stories would finally be heard. The surgery would fix her appendix, but her real work, fixing the system, was just beginning. 2 weeks after the emergency room incident, Thompson sat at her desk in the FBI office, surrounded by stacks of patient records. Her surgical scar was still healing, but her determination was stronger than ever. The investigation had uncovered far more than anyone expected. "You need to see this," said her lead investigator, placing another file on her desk. "We found a pattern going back 5 years. Similar symptoms, similar dismissals, all involving minority patients." He pointed to a graph showing clear disparities in wait times and treatment approvals. The young nurse from that night had become a key witness, providing detailed accounts of incidents she observed. Her courage in coming forward had inspired other hospital staff to speak up too. The wall behind Thompson's desk was now covered with a timeline of cases, each representing a patient who had faced similar discrimination. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," said another agent, holding up a list of new testimonies. Once the story got out, people started calling from other hospitals too. This is bigger than just one emergency room. Former patients shared heartbreaking stories of being dismissed, disbelieved, and denied proper care. Thompson reviewed security camera footage from the emergency room, watching hours of waiting room interactions. The patterns were clear. Certain patients consistently waited longer, received less attention, and were more likely to be discharged without proper examination. "Look at these prescription records," her team's data analyst pointed out. "There's a clear bias in pain medication prescriptions. Some patients were automatically flagged as drug-seeking based on nothing but demographics." The evidence was mounting, painting a picture of systematic discrimination that couldn't be ignored. The hospital's administration had initially tried to paint the incident as isolated, but the numbers told a different story. Thompson's team had uncovered hundreds of complaints that had been buried or dismissed. Each file represented someone who had suffered in silence, thinking they had no power to fight back. "We found something else," said the young nurse, who now regularly volunteered information. Some doctors were falsifying wait times in the records to hide how long certain patients were left without care. She had brought documentation showing how the system was manipulated to conceal discriminatory practices. As Thompson reviewed the evidence, she remembered the faces in the waiting room that night, The elderly woman who had been waiting even longer than she had, the young mother with her sick child, the man clutching his chest who had been told it was probably just anxiety. The investigation wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It had become a mission to give voice to those who had been silenced. Local news stations began covering the story, and more witnesses came forward each day. Other hospitals in the region started reviewing their own practices, worried they might be next. "The medical board wants to meet with us," an agent announced, walking in with more files. "They're taking this seriously now that we've shown them the numbers." The statistics were undeniable, showing clear patterns of discrimination that had gone unchecked for years. Thompson's team worked late into the night, piecing together years of systematic bias. They'd found doctors who had been reported multiple times but never faced consequences, administrators who buried complaints, and policies that enabled discrimination under the guise of professional judgment. The young nurse had brought in more hospital staff who wanted to help. "People are finally feeling brave enough to speak up," she explained. "They've been wanting to do this for years but were afraid of losing their jobs. The investigation had given them the protection they needed to tell the truth." As the sun set outside her office window, Thompson looked at the wall of cases. Each file represented someone who had faced discrimination when they were most vulnerable. But now, these stories would lead to real change. The investigation wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about fixing a broken system. "We're not just looking at one hospital anymore," she told her team. "This investigation is going to change how emergency rooms across the country handle patient care." The evidence they'd gathered would be impossible to ignore, forcing hospitals everywhere to confront their own biases. The investigation had revealed something powerful. When one person stands up against discrimination, it gives others the courage to do the same. What started as one agent's emergency room visit had become a movement for change in healthcare, proving that justice can start with a single voice refusing to be silenced. 6 months after that fateful night in the emergency room, Thompson stood at the podium in the hospital's main conference room. The room was packed with reporters, hospital staff, and community members, all waiting to hear about the changes their investigation had sparked. "Today marks a new chapter in healthcare equality," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "What started as a single incident has led to fundamental changes in how emergency care is provided, not just here, but across our entire healthcare system." The discriminatory doctor had faced serious consequences. The medical board had suspended his license pending a full review, and other hospitals were now examining his past employment records. But this wasn't about one person, it was about changing the whole system. Behind Thompson stood the young nurse who had first witnessed the discrimination, now promoted to patient advocacy coordinator. She had helped design new reporting systems that made it easier for staff to speak up when they saw unfair treatment. "No one should feel powerless to help a patient in need," she had said during her interview for the position. The hospital had undergone a complete transformation. New policies required regular reviews of patient wait times and treatment decisions. Security cameras now monitored the waiting room, not for security but to ensure fair treatment. Every complaint was logged and investigated, with monthly reports sent directly to the hospital board. In the past 6 months, Thompson continued, average wait times have decreased by 40% for all patients. More importantly, the racial disparities in treatment times have been virtually eliminated. She gestured to charts showing the dramatic improvement in patient care statistics. The elderly woman who had been waiting that night was in the audience. She had become one of the first members of the hospital's new patient advisory board, ensuring that community voices were heard in every major decision. "Things are different now," she told reporters. "You can feel it as soon as you walk in." The hospital administrator stepped forward to announce new training programs. Every staff member, from doctors to security guards, now undergoes mandatory bias training, he explained. "But more than that, we've changed how we measure success. Patient outcomes and satisfaction are now tracked across all demographics." Thompson's investigation had spread beyond this one hospital. Medical boards across the state were implementing new oversight procedures. Other hospitals had started their own internal reviews, not wanting to be the next headline. Real change was happening, driven by the power of one incident that could no longer be ignored. The young nurse's voice shook slightly as she shared her perspective. 6 months ago, I was afraid to speak up when I saw something wrong. Now, speaking up is part of our job description. We're trained to be advocates, not just caregivers. Community members stood to share their recent experiences. A mother described how differently she was treated during her latest emergency room visit. An elderly man talked about how staff took time to listen to his concerns. Each story confirmed that the changes weren't just on paper, they were real and meaningful. But our work isn't finished, Thompson reminded everyone. This is just the beginning. Every hospital in this country needs to look at their practices and ask hard questions about equality in healthcare. Her team had already started working with other FBI offices to expand the investigation nationwide. The hospital had become a model for others to follow. Medical schools were sending students to learn about the new procedures. Healthcare administrators from other states came to study the changes. What had started as one woman's stand against discrimination had become a blueprint for systemic change. As the press conference ended, Thompson stayed to talk with community members. Each person had a story to share about past experiences, about recent improvements, about hope for the future. This was why she had become an FBI agent, not just to enforce laws, but to help create real change in people's lives. The emergency room that had once been a place of discrimination was now a symbol of progress. New signs in multiple languages welcomed all patients. The waiting room had been redesigned to be more comfortable and inclusive. Most importantly, every patient was treated with the respect and care they deserved. Remember, Thompson concluded, justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a hospital gown. But it always requires people willing to stand up for what's right. Her words echoed through the room, a reminder that change begins with one person refusing to accept discrimination as normal. As she left the podium, Thompson thought about how a simple emergency room visit had turned into something so much bigger. It proved that justice could appear in unexpected places and that real change was possible when people worked together to make it happen.